So I did my presentation on the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War was a long and costly war that lasted from 1954 to 1975, and many Vietnamese citizens and American soldiers were killed during it. The Vietnam War was the prolonged struggle between nationalist forces attempting to unify the country of Vietnam under a communist government and the United States, with the aid of the South Vietnamese, attempting to prevent the spread of communism. Engaged in a war that many viewed as having no way to win, U.S. leaders lost the Americans' public support for the war. Since the end of the war, the Vietnam War has become a benchmark for what not to do in all future U.S. foreign conflicts. Some of the reasons for this war were European colonialism, Cold War politics, and the Vietnamese calls for independence. In the 1800s, France established control over Indochina as it asserted its claims over Vietnam. America faced a major conflict. The U.S. supported decolonization, however, it wanted to maintain France as an ally in its Cold War effort to contain the Soviet Union. While this was occurring, some Vietnamese rebelled against France's exploitative rule, and communist leaders such as Ho Chi Minh emerged in order to call for and demand Vietnam's freedom from French rule. All these simultaneous conflicts eventually led to America's involvement in Vietnamese affairs. So some of the main events of the Vietnam War start on September 2nd, 1945. On September 2nd, 1945, Vietnam declares independence from France. Neither France nor the U.S. recognizes this claim. President Harry S. Truman aids France with military equipment to fight the rebels known as Viet Minh. In 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu results in serious defeat for the French and peace talks in Geneva. The Geneva Accords end the French Indochina War. Vietnam signs the Geneva Accords and divides into two countries at the 17th parallel, the communist-led North and the U.S.-supported South. From 1957 to 1963, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong fight South Vietnamese troops. Hoping to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, the U.S. sends more aid and military advisors to help the South Vietnamese government. The number of U.S. military advisors in Vietnam grows from 900 in 1960 to 11,000 in 1962. From 1964 to 1965. By 1964, the Viet Cong, the communist guerrilla force, has 35,000 troops in South Vietnam. The U.S. sends more and more troops to fight the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, with the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam peaking at 543,000 in April 1969. Anti-war sentiment in the U.S. grows stronger as the troop numbers increase. On August 2, 1964, the North Vietnamese fire on a U.S. destroyer anchored in the Gulf of Tonkin. After President Lyndon Johnson falsely claims that there has been a second attack on the destroyer, Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorizes full-scale U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War. Johnson orders the bombing of North Vietnam in retaliation for the Tonkin attack. On January 30, 1968, the North Vietnamese launch a massive surprise attack during the festival of the Vietnamese New Year called Tet. The attack hits 36 major cities and towns in South Vietnam. Both sides suffer heavy casualties, but the offensive demonstrates that the war will not end soon or easily. American public opinion against the war increases, and the U.S. begins to reduce the number of troops in Vietnam. March 16, 1968. About 400 women, children, and elderly men are massacred by the U.S. forces in the village of My Lai in South Vietnam. Lieutenant William L. Calley Jr. is later court-martialed for leading the raid and sentenced to life in prison for his role, but was released in 1974 when a federal court overturns the conviction. He is the only soldier ever convicted in connection with the event. April 1970. Invasion of Cambodia. President Richard Nixon orders U.S. and South Vietnamese troops to invade border areas in Cambodia and destroy supply centers set up by the North Vietnamese. The invasion sparks more anti-war protest, and on June 3, 1970, Nixon announces the completion of troop withdrawal. May 4, 1970, National Guard units fire into a group of demonstrators at Kent State University in Ohio. The shots kill 4 students and wound 9 others. Anti-war demonstrations and riots occur on hundreds of other campuses throughout May. February 8, 1971. Under orders from President Nixon, U.S. and South Vietnamese ground troops, with the support of B-52 bombers, invade southern Laos in an effort to stop the North Vietnamese supply routes through Laos into South Vietnam. This action is done without consent of Congress and causes more anti-war protests in the U.S. January 27, 1973. A ceasefire, which is a temporary suspension of fighting, was arranged after peace talks. March 29, 1973. The last American ground troops leave. Fighting begins again between North and South Vietnam, but the U.S. does not return. April 30, 1975. South Vietnam surrenders to North Vietnam as North Vietnamese troops enter Saigon, which is now called Ho Chi Minh City. So the main countries involved in the Vietnam War were South Vietnam and North Vietnam. South Vietnam was backed by anti-communist countries and members of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, also known as SEATO. It included the United States, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, New Zealand, Thailand, the Khmer Republic, Kingdom of Laos, and the Republic of China. North Vietnam was backed by communist forces, which included Phatet Lao, Khmer Rouge, People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea. Some of the most famous Vietnam War historical personalities were Ho Chi Minh, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and William Calley. Ho Chi Minh. He was the primary Vietnamese nationalist and communist leader during the 20th century who resisted French, Japanese, and American influence in Vietnam. He founded the Indochina Communist Party in 1930 and the Viet Minh in 1941. From its founding to his death in 1969, he was the president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, serving as the primary North Vietnamese leader throughout much of the Vietnam War. Lyndon B. Johnson. He was the 36th U.S. president who promised to honor his predecessor, John F. Kennedy's limited U.S. commitments in Vietnam, but ended up escalating the war drastically after the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964. Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson from 1961 to 1968. McNamara initially advocated increasing U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but started to question U.S. policy by 1966. John F. Kennedy was the 35th U.S. president whose decision to send U.S. military advisors into Vietnam in 1962 marked the first official U.S. involvement in the country. Richard Nixon was the 37th U.S. president who orchestrated the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam in the early 1970s. And finally, William Calley was a U.S. Army lieutenant and the leader of the company of U.S. soldiers who killed several hundred unarmed Vietnamese civilians in the 1968 My Lai massacre. A 1971 court-martial sentenced Calley to a life prison term, but many Americans believe that he was a scapegoat for larger government atrocities. Fighting between South Vietnamese and communists continued despite the peace agreement until North Vietnam launched an offensive in early 1975. South Vietnam's requests for aid were denied by the U.S. Congress, and after Thieu abandoned the north half of the country to the advancing communists, a panic ensued. South Vietnamese resistance collapsed, and North Vietnamese troops marched into Saigon on April 30, 1975. Vietnam was formally reunified in July 1976, and Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. U.S. casualties in Vietnam during the era of direct U.S. involvement, which was from 1961 to 1972, were more than 50,000. South Vietnamese dead were estimated at more than 400,000, and Viet Cong and North Vietnamese at over 900,000. That was the end of my presentation, and this was my works cited. Thank you.